We've been in a long section in 1 Corinthians on public worship, which has been difficult in places and in some ways has been kind of challenging in various different ways. And it's almost as if Paul comes back to the heart of the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15. So I'm going to read the first 11 verses of 1 Corinthians 15, which, as Micah said, is on 1156. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you've believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it is I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believed.
Morning, everybody. It's good to be back. And if you've not met me before, my name is Micah. I'm one of the elders at the Gate Church, and it's as Johnny said, it's a real privilege to be exploring and beginning in this really exciting, quite long, but full of amazing things, this chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. As I was preparing over the last week or so, I was reminded actually quite recently of a childhood memory where one of my older sisters, I'm one of five, one of my older sisters took, along with her boyfriend, took me and my little sister on a mystery road trip. And I say mystery because nobody in the car knew where we were going to go. Not me, not my little sister, not my older sister, not her boyfriend who was driving. Because the game was that me and Martha, my little sister, were each going to take it in turns to choose a direction. Okay, so we hit a roundabout and I say left, or if it's Martha's turn, she goes like second exit or something like that. And we spent about, I'd say, an hour and a half just having the best time of our lives, just like going who knows where. It took us about 90 minutes. We had so much fun, and we were filled with excitement as we were about to get out of the car to find ourselves in, can I have a drum roll, please? Thank you. Alton. Yeah. For those of you who aren't as familiar with the north of England, suffice to say that we'd taken about 3 times longer than we should have to get to a town that's probably most famous for its League One football club that's been bankrupt about 4 times in 5 years or something like that. And that pretty much summarizes Bolton for you. In the end, me and Martha, my little sister, we were so focused on the act of going somewhere that we forgot actually to think about where we were going to go. We didn't look at any signs. We didn't think about where we could be aiming for. And so we didn't end up anywhere very exciting. And actually, I think we often hear this thing said to us by people where they say something like the journey is more important than the destination or something like that. But all of us really know that just isn't true, don't we? Because how we live depends on where we think we're heading. How we live depends on where we think we're heading. And that isn't just true for like me and you as isolated individuals. That is true for all of us and how we live together. The world we're making reveals our beliefs about where the world is going. So far in 1 Corinthians, we've been through we've done some really good work going through from chapter 1 all the way through to chapter 14, and they have been showing us how to live. They've been showing us how to live in the way of the cross. How to live a crucified life, you might say. But we can't end there, can we? We can't end at chapter 14, because those chapters can only be good news. They can only be life-giving, or as Paul writes in verses 1 and 2, they can only be gospel for us if we have chapter 15. If we can move from a crucified life to a resurrection life. And so whilst we've looked at how we are to live in chapters 1 to 14, chapter 15 is going to give us a really clear vision of where we're going, where we're heading. So I want you to imagine this morning, maybe like this big kind of domino run that's kind of going all the way along kind of E.R. Mason, maybe up and down the stairs or something like that. You know what I mean? Where there's somebody's taking the time to put one domino in front of the other and taking hours. And verses 1 to 11 is me just hitting that first domino. And then the preceding weeks, what we're going to see is that just coming cascading along, doing more than we could have actually imagined one thing could do. And so in these verses 1 to 11, Paul is saying that to know where we're heading, to know where we're going, we need to know something really, really clearly. And that's this. Jesus really did die, and he really did rise. Jesus really did die, and he really did rise. You see, Paul spends an awful lot of time in the preceding chapter to labor this point. You can see it in the kind of evidence for the death and resurrection that he reminds the Corinthians that he's passed on to them. He tells them that the scriptures promised it. Jesus' death and his resurrection were both according to the scriptures. These events have been promised for millennia as the hope for all sinners who've got a problem with God that they can't fix themselves. From the opening pages of the Bible, where we see a promised son who is going to crush the head of the serpent. We move through the prophetic Psalms of David, where he describes his king, so a literal king of kings who's going to sit at the right hand of God. We move to a promised servant who is going to be silent as a lamb, who's going to be pierced for our transgressions, who's going to be crushed for our sake. All is clear. The scriptures are not silent about Jesus. The Old Testament is not silent about Jesus or about his mission. And as if that wasn't enough, eyewitnesses saw it. Both Jesus' burial in a tomb under Roman guard and his resurrection appearances are given as supporting evidence that these events aren't just myth. They're not just kind of urban legend. They are claims about something that either did or didn't happen. Over 500 people saw Jesus after he died, Paul says. You can ask them. Most of them are still alive decades later. Now, in our culture, I think it's probably born out of this desire for everybody to just kind of get along. It can become quite trendy, can't it, to take some of what are quite frankly, quite wild claims that the Bible makes about Jesus and to reduce them to something a bit like, like Aesop's fables. Are you familiar with them from primary school? We're not meant to take the hare and the tortoise all that seriously as a description of actual historical events, are we? We don't need to do that. And actually, probably Aesop would have thought we were being a bit strange if we did. But that doesn't mean it's not meaningful or doesn't have truth to give us in some way. But the thing is, though, we can't really read this passage in that way, can we? We can't really read this passage and reach the conclusion that that is how Paul wants us to treat what he's saying. No, Paul is saying Jesus really did die. His heart stopped. His body went cold and was laid in a tomb. It had a huge stone rolled in front to stop anybody from interfering with the body. And he's saying that Jesus really did rise from the dead. In the darkness of that tomb, Jesus' heart started beating. Warmth returned to his body. He sat up. He folded up the shroud he'd been covered in and somehow managed to remove a stone that no one mere man could hope to budge on their own. might sound nuts to you this morning, mightn't it? It might stretch your understanding of what is possible to absolute breaking point. And here's the thing, it should sound nuts. Normal people can't do that. No one before or since Jesus has been able to credibly claim that they have power even over their own death, let alone anybody else's. So quite frankly, Jesus is either a normal person, in which case these 11 verses make absolutely no sense, and have absolutely no bearing on reality for us or for anybody else, or he is the true and the living God. He is the author of life. He is the divine king of the cosmos, who for reasons beyond my understanding seems to care so deeply for relative mayflies like you and me that he joined us in our tiny, short experience, in our broken and spoiled creation. And if that's who Jesus is, then I want to boldly suggest that I want to say that the cross and the resurrection are absolutely in character for him. For a God who humbles himself out of love, for a human race that has, at our best, ignored him, and at our worst, has taken the good things he's given us and thrown them in his face. A God who, out of love for rebels and for enemies, bore the indignity of poverty, the persecution of political tyrants, and religious hypocrites. If that is who Jesus is, then the cross and the resurrection, they might be unexpected. They might be more than we could ever dare to hope. They might even shock or offend. But I don't think we can look at the God that Jesus claims to be and just kind of say to ourselves like, nah. Crucifixion and resurrection, no, that doesn't sound like him, does it? No, if you're here today and you're not sure what you make of Jesus, there we go. If you're here today and you're not sure what you make of Jesus, can I encourage you that this is one of the most important questions you can be asking yourself. What do I make of Jesus? What do I make of Jesus? What kind of person do I think he is? Because that question is absolutely essential to all of the other questions we might have about the Christian faith, to our questions about the cross or about the resurrection. Quite frankly, no other question can get behind or around that one, can it? What do I make of Jesus? And if we really want to see how this plays out in real-world terms, then Paul is generous enough to offer himself up as Exhibit A. You see, on top of the kind of give or take 500 eyewitnesses that he's mentioned that are available to the Corinthians, Paul also kind of name drops a couple of people. And we've met some of them before. We've got Cephas, otherwise known as Peter, and Jesus' own brother James, and as well as those two people who I'd say were some of the people who knew him best. We've also got the 12, referring to the 12 disciples, and then some more apostles. And you know, this is quite a catalogue of big names. These were the people who knew Jesus, who loved him. They were the people who grieved him when he died, and they were the first to fall on their knees at the sight of him just days later. But there's another name on that list. At the end, Paul puts himself. He says, last of all, he appeared to me as to one abnormally born. And I don't know if you're unsurprised to see Paul's name on that list. Maybe you know, he is a big hitter in the Bible, isn't he? He's if you remove his letters, if you remove his writing from the New Testament, you half it in size. And then you've got all the other bits of writing that talk about him in Acts and in letters from Peter and stuff like that. Of course he's going to appear on this list. But Paul's arrival on the church scene isn't a smooth one. Okay, we're not going to see him on the front row in Pentecost with his hands in the air. No, he's going to be dragging people out of the back to interrogate them and to snuff out this Jesus movement once and for all. And when he does meet with Jesus, or I should say when Jesus meets with him, when his life does this about turn, you can hear this note of caution in the voices of the people who were interacting with him at first. But we don't even have to listen to them. We can listen to Paul himself and how he describes it in verses 9 and 10. He says, "For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect." You see, Paul didn't approach the news about Jesus' resurrection with healthy skepticism. No, he approached it with fury, with hatred. I don't know about you. I know that many people worry that their testimony, their story of how they became followers of Jesus, isn't exciting enough, that it's not as glamorous as other people's. Well, I think if we manage to kind of time travel Paul to 21st century Birmingham and teach him English, I think the best translation we get to how he described his story in modern English would probably be something like train wreck. Okay? When Jesus met with Paul, he met a man who was quite literally hell-bent on annihilating the church. And he slammed into him with the force of a locomotive. Jesus left Paul's life, his old life, in tatters. He left him humiliated, even physically blind for a time. And how does Paul describe that meeting? This kind of face-to-face showdown with the divine King of heaven and earth? Verse 10, it's the grace of God. Paul tells the Corinthians, you want to know that Jesus is alive? Look at me. Take a good look at the man who abandoned everything he once held dear because he met the one who killed death. Take a look at the man who switched from being this kind of hotshot Pharisee to the kind of loser who isn't even respected by the church he's writing to, the church he even planted. Every bit of me, Paul is saying, from my beliefs and my convictions to my actions and my life, is a walking testimony to the reality of the cross and the resurrection. He has gone from being the disciple of one of the most well-known, well-respected religious leaders of his day to being even the least of the apostles. Not even considering himself worthy of that title. Forget changing his mind intellectually for a second. Have you ever asked yourself how on earth a figure like Paul could have ever been content with that kind of life? Life according to the way of the cross. This life of weakness and sacrifice that is utter foolishness. We've read according to the values, the principles of the world. A life of unpaid, unhoused, itinerant ministry. And as if that weren't incredible enough, Paul's encounter with the risen Jesus leads him to go further and to work harder than even those who are part of Jesus' inner circle. And none of this because of anything in himself. But it was a result of the grace of God that was at work in him. If the resurrection of Jesus is true, then life according to the way of the cross isn't just a sacrifice, whether noble or anything else. It is an investment. It's the sowing of a seed that Paul intends to harvest in a new kind of life. Over the next few weeks, we're going to see precisely what that means for us and for the whole church. But right here, Paul is kind of just zooming in and helping us to take note of what has happened to him. He wants the Corinthians to acknowledge the extent to which Jesus' resurrection has transformed him, even him. I think sometimes we can think, when we describe Paul as an example for us, well, we're like, oh, well, that was Paul, he's really holy or whatever. But actually, it's kind of the opposite here, isn't it? We look at, if this can happen to Paul, it can happen to me. And I think this matters deeply for all of us here at the Gate Church today. For those of us who are followers of Jesus, we need to ask ourselves, to what extent is my life a walking testimony to the resurrection of Jesus from the dead? To what extent have the values of the cross that we've read about in the past 14 chapters in 1 Corinthians become the shape of my life? The willingness to look foolish in front of people who don't trust in Jesus. The willingness to let go of our own privileges, our own entitlements, for the sake of those around us. The willingness to honor leaders who embody sacrificial love, even if they look weak and ineffective in the eyes of the world. You see, this is only possible to the extent that we understand that Jesus really is alive. And the amount we're willing to take up our own crosses is only possible according to the amount we believe that the resurrection of Jesus is a past, present, and future reality for us. Jesus has been raised from the dead. He is providing us with new spiritual life today. And one day he will restore the whole of the universe to its intended glory. And the thing is, I worry sometimes that we are in danger of treating the Christian life a bit more like an all-you-can-eat buffet than anything else. We look around, we pick the bits we like, we skip over anything that looks a bit weird or unappetizing, which is most things for me. I'm a bit of a too fussy eater. But I don't know if you've noticed this about all-you-can-eat buffets. They're designed, aren't they, to get you feeling as full as possible, as quickly as possible. But they are not actually designed to properly fill you up. So for the sheer amount on offer, the value for money is pretty low. So just as a quick recommendation, I wouldn't recommend it for your meal. You're full enough to leave quickly, which is what they need, but you'll be hungry before you even reach your front door. But on the other hand, I want you to imagine being invited to the home of Toby and Kath Giles for dinner. Okay? If you haven't met them, they're wonderful, and they consider it a personal challenge to make sure that nobody leaves their table hungry. And just in case, they will probably see to it that people will be sent home with leftovers. And I know for a fact that Toby would prefer to go hungry himself than for any guest to leave the table feeling anything less than 100% satisfied. It might feel like a bit of a silly example, but I think it does bear out in our own lives. Because we can be so quick to kind of live out these compartmentalized lives where we divide up our lives and our energies and we portion them out in order of what takes priority for us. We might call them things of first importance. This much of my life goes to my personal dreams, and then this bit to my career, and then this much to my family, this much to my church, this much to Netflix, this much to my Bible. Probably in that order, if we're looking at time-wise. But throughout this letter, Paul is saying something totally different to that, isn't he? He's saying, if you belong to Jesus, all of you does. All of your life is his. All of it has been crucified with him. All of it has been raised with him. And we don't get to pick and choose. Instead, we ask ourselves, do I trust the one who is serving me? Can I trust him? And that's a serious question we need to ask ourselves, isn't it? Because if I don't trust him, I'm only going to follow him for as long as it's convenient. And as we've seen in the last 14 chapters, that's not going to be very long, is it? I've said already, living according to the way of the cross is only sustainable to the extent that it's not wasted time, to the extent that it's instead an investment in the life to come. How are we going to choose the thing that feels a little bit like death, time after time? How are you going to love others patiently who really, really try your patience? How are you going to be able to trust leaders that look and are totally weak? We have to know that the crucified life is the necessary ingredient for the resurrected life. Again, it's not like that all-you-can-eat buffet situation where if you don't like noodles, you can switch it out for rice or something like that. It's much more like flour in bread. Okay, you can't just take the flour out and have just a smaller meal. Even if you could remove it, all you'd be left with is a mess. And in a similar way, we're only going to be able to keep going in the way of Jesus if we're able to trust him, not just in this life, but for the next. We won't be able to stop ourselves from taking justice into our own hands unless we know that Jesus is currently ruling as the divine king. We won't be able to show sacrificial and cheerful love if we think it's ultimately going to be a waste. We won't be able to persevere unless we're confident that, in the words of Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. How are you doing today? How is it going for you today, this sort of thing? Is there a chance that some of us might be feeling a bit tired, a bit fatigued? And is there a chance that this morning it doesn't quite sound like good news, this? It sounds much more like one more heavy burden, one more guilt trip. If that's you this morning, can I gently suggest that it's not about just digging deep and finding more resources, more time, more energy from somewhere to give over to God? And because that might look like the natural response to what Paul's saying here. But realistically, that's just like kind of reshuffling a deck that's already stacked against you from the start. It's still the same compartmentalization that got us into the mess in the first place. Now, if today it feels like maybe Jesus is just asking a little bit too much of us, could it actually be that we've forgotten what it really is that fills our existence with life and power? Ben Moore will testify to this, that whenever I take my laptop to somewhere that isn't my house or my office, I'm always leaving the charger at home. And because my laptop has seen better days, it doesn't take very long before it just starts to run very low on battery. And so we have to kind of look around for solutions. You know, you turn the volume right down, you turn the screen brightness so down that you can kind of barely see anything and that sort of thing. And what does that give you? Is that a solution? And it gives me maybe 45 minutes, maybe. But realistically, for that 45 minutes, everything's just a bit harder to use before the screen eventually goes from dim to black. And it's utterly useless. It is not the solution. No, the solution is I need to plug it in. I need to remember my charger. That is the action I need to take. That isn't simply just delaying the inevitable, but sorting out the problem. Or you could say I might need to buy myself a new laptop, but I think the same thing applies. You see, if we're getting to our lowest spiritual ebb, then the remedy is actually quite similar to that. It's not simply reshuffling or redistributing or cutting out the bits of my Christian life that I can't account for from other parts of my life. And instead of reshuffling, instead of redistributing, we need to be returning to what was passed on to us as of first importance. What has been passed on from Jesus to Paul, to the Corinthians, down through history, to us here today. Jesus really did die for us, according to the Scriptures. He really was raised for us, according to those same Scriptures. And if we throw ourselves in with him now, his present is our future. How we live today depends on entirely where we think we're heading, on how hopeful we are about the future. I mentioned Martin Luther King earlier, and some of you might know he's named after this kind of renegade monk called Martin Luther, who, despite his achievements like translating the New Testament into the common language and launching the Protestant church, regularly battled with periods of intense spiritual darkness and despair and hopelessness. People are less familiar, though, with his wife, Katie. She, too, was a runaway, this time nun, obviously. She ran a few side hustles. She was a bookkeeper, she was a beer brewer, she was a butcher, all of the bees, amongst other things. She was also indispensable to Martin. His ministry and his life would have just fallen apart without her basically holding things together. And during one particularly dark season, Martin Luther was held in this grip of a spiritual hopelessness and despair that he just couldn't get out of, couldn't reason it or work his way out of. In walks Katie into his study in this very somber black dress. And, like myself, he probably thought he'd kind of got his diary wrong and said, "Are you going to a funeral?" And she replies to him, "No. But since you're acting like God is dead, I wanted to join you in your mourning." Apparently, that was the thing that fixed it for him that time, and things got better. But I think it bears saying, where we think we're heading, how hopeful we think about the future, all of those things depend on who we think Jesus is. And so As I close this morning, I want to speak to all of us, but maybe especially to those of us who are feeling a bit fatigued, a bit tired, and tempted to give up. Tempted to think that whatever costs following in the way of Jesus requires of you today are just too high. If that's you, or when that's you, I want you to ask yourself this question. Where is Jesus right now? Where is Jesus right now? How is he doing today? Have you any reason to doubt today that he might lose his grip on you? The one and only Son of the Father. The one who can tell the weather what to do. The one who can heal the sick with just a word. Who can undo death with a word. Your future today is as secure as his is. Your present is as meaningful as his is, and your life is hidden in him. Do not let go of the only one who has the power to turn crosses into victories, to turn graves into empty tombs, and to turn death into life. Instead, we press on through the cross, through the way of the cross, into resurrection life. Shall I pray for us as we entrust ourselves to him again? Heavenly Father, we thank you that Jesus, the divine King, the one who rules and reigns and is worthy of mine and our worship, he is alive today. His life today is unending and is mine and ours. Help us to receive, maybe for the first time, maybe for the 100th time, that life, that grace, and that mercy that is on offer for us today, because he died for us and he is alive and reigns for us today. Amen.